Well, you can go ahead and grab your Bibles and turn to the Gospel of John. Chapter 10 is where we're going to be at this morning. So let me get this queued up. There we go. John chapter 10. As we're continuing in this gospel, seeking the same intention that John had in writing it, you might remember what that happens to be, right? That this gospel was written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. John continues to point us to Jesus. And in pointing us to Jesus, he's helping us realize how we're meant to respond to him. So there's a story that I have meant to help us as we are kind of narrow down our focus for this morning in particular. It's of a farmer who one day was milking his cow. And when he happened to look up, he saw a fly buzz into the ear of the cow, and he didn't think much of it. And so he continued milking her and finally got to the point where he was done. And then he happened to look into the pail and noticed that there was a fly in the milk pail. And he chuckled to himself and he said, "Well, I guess that's just in one ear and out the other." All right, see. So two things I always look for when I tell a joke like that. One is that laugh right there. The second is I look at Benjamin's face, because I know how good that joke was, because he has no filter. I know exactly how bad it is by his reaction and his eye roll. But bad jokes aside, today our focus is on the importance of listening to Jesus, that things don't go out in one ear and out the other, and the impact that our ability to respond to him is dependent upon that reality. So in our passage, Jesus is using a common illustration for that culture, right? And before we get into really diving into that comparison that he begins to make, I want us to remember the context. So this passage is still connected to chapters 7 through 9. Sometimes there could be a tendency for us to look at this and think that Jesus is somehow, it's a different setting or a different thing. He's just beginning to talk about sheep out of the blue, right? But this is connected to what he's been saying in 7 through 9. And there's two observations that help us realize that. One, there's a comment that's made in verse 21, referencing the man who was healed, that was born blind. And it's done in such a way where it just seems like it's a natural follow-up to that situation. And then also, there's no scene change really until verse 22, where it talks about the fact that during the Feast of Dedication, and as the story continues on. And those things help us realize, again, this is connected to that overall scene through 7 and 9, where Jesus is interacting with people at the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles, and in that interaction, people are having a hard time hearing what he's saying in a way that it's difficult for them to believe in him, and it's difficult for them to respond to him. And so if we look at it through that lens, it really helps us see not only what Jesus is saying, but more importantly, why he's choosing to use this image at this point. And so let's dive into the passage, begin reading in verse 1. Jesus says, "Very truly I tell you Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate but climbs in by some other way is a thief and a robber. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them. And his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice." Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. So let's pause right there and recognize that the first thing Jesus wants us to understand is that the sheep of the Good Shepherd follow his voice. Now, I want us to realize it's not that the Pharisees didn't understand what Jesus was saying, as if he was giving them new information about the dynamics between a sheep and their shepherd. For them, they're just wondering why he's talking about it now, right? Again, keeping in mind this is happening in the midst of the context. They've just been in an argument where Jesus is talking about the voices that they listen to, and they're saying, we're disciples of Moses, and there's this continual disagreements and all the things that they're doing, Jesus points out this saying, so they're having a hard time. Why at the tail end of this interaction do you go to saying this teaching? That's what they're having a hard time understanding. Well, like, what are you talking about now, Jesus? Like, why bring this up? To them, it seems a bit out of the blue, right? But if we keep that context in mind, it makes a lot of sense. They continue to miss the point of what Jesus has been saying to them over the course of, 10 chapters now. And Jesus uses this comparison to show them the reason for that. They're unfamiliar with his voice. And they don't recognize the role the Father sent him to fulfill, which is the Good Shepherd. And because of those realities, when he says something, they're having a hard time responding to the things that he's saying. And so let's think about this for a minute. Why do sheep follow the voice of a shepherd? Well, they've grown accustomed to listening to what that voice sounds like, but it's not just that, right? Because they can hear, if the shepherd always came in and hit the sheep every time he was around them, well, they would automatically flee, right? Because they would associate that voice with danger. What Jesus is saying is sheep that are under the good shepherd recognize that when the shepherd speaks, his intent is to lead them to life, to protect them from things that could harm them. And so over time, they have learned to trust the voice of the Good Shepherd. And over time, they are continually willing to respond to him as a result. And it's very different with voices that they're not familiar with. I mean, if you've heard a sermon on Psalm 23 or this passage, you know that most people like to point out how stupid sheep are and how skittish they are and how quick they are to get themselves in danger and how dependent they are upon the right voice. And so when they hear a voice that they're not familiar with, they just flee, right? Because they're not certain that voice is going to lead to a desirable outcome. And so Jesus is drawing this illustration, like, the reason you can't hear what I'm saying is you can't hear my voice because you don't recognize that I'm the Good Shepherd. And it should be clear to them. It should be clear especially to that culture, because they would have been very familiar with that imagery. It was a part of everyday life in Israel, to see shepherds and to understand the interactions that they had. But because they're unable to trust in the voice, what actually ends up happening is that Jesus' voice appears to them as if it's a thief or a robber, and they don't trust where Jesus is leading. And on top of that, they don't trust where Jesus might be leading other people to as well. And so there's this resistance among them. It's not desirable. And what they've demonstrated by this is that they've become accustomed to listen to other voices, following the opinions of other people and thinking that they're worth listening to. And that becomes a problem because those other voices don't always have their best intentions in mind, even if it's their own, right? Just like a sheep, sometimes a sheep goes into a place that isn't beneficial for them to go to, walks right into a wolf's den, so to speak. And Jesus is trying to help them to see this dynamic, but they're just not getting what he's saying. They're not getting why he's saying it in this point. And so what Jesus does is he presses into the comparison, and he continues on in verse 7. Therefore, Jesus said again, very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and they will go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks and the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. From this section, we're reminded of the truth that the sheep of the good shepherd find protection and contentment in him. So in Jesus' time, when shepherds led their flocks to graze, like there's a tendency for us to view this simply as if we would sheep around our farm, right? Because that's the image we have. Sheep generally stay around. They don't graze all over the place, typically, in our culture. They're usually confined a little bit more. But in that culture, the shepherds would lead their, especially in a desert culture, there is an abundance of grass nearby always. And so a shepherd would lead them to different places so that they could find pasture, so that they could eat. And in doing so, they would leave the comforts of home sometimes. And so what they would do is while they're out in the countryside, they would end up at nighttime finding whether it's a cave or some similar structure like that to kind of corral the sheep in. And being in the countryside, those caves didn't always come with doors. Oftentimes they didn't. And what a shepherd would do is they would lay down in front of the entrance of the cave and become like a living gate themselves. And when the sheep would enter into that cave, they would find salvation, in a sense, from everything that was threatening them around them. From all the potential robbers, the thieves, the wolves, anything that would try to attack them. They would be safe in his care. And that shepherd would continue to be able to lead them onto life and to find good pasture and to continue to take them in the direction that they wanted to go. And so when Jesus is again, this is not new information to who Jesus is talking to. They understood how this functioned in their culture. And what we're reminded of, what Jesus is saying is he is that gate upon which we enter in for safety from the threats that surround us. By entering in, we find salvation through him. We find protection from the threats that are around us. In him, we find contentment. He's the good shepherd. He is near, and his desire is to give life. And that's quite contrary to the commitment and the intentions of other people that Jesus points out in this passage. Thieves and robbers seek to lure the sheep astray with the intent of either bringing destruction, either stealing them, or killing them, whatever happened to be. And Satan is such a great example of this. The intent that he has is to bring destruction, to steal things from us, to kill various things in our lives, whatever that happens to be. Whatever ways he can bring destruction and separate us from the good shepherd who wants to bring life. And without entering by the right gate, we're left more vulnerable to his schemes. We're at greater danger. And that's why Jesus is saying, I'm the gate. Enter by me. Stay near to me. And find security, find protection, find contentment next to me. And then Jesus points out these hired hands who were entrusted to take care of the sheep, right? Sometimes maybe the shepherd wasn't able to, so he would pay someone to watch his flock while he had to take care of something else. But these hired hands are often not as concerned about the condition of the sheep as the shepherd are. They basically just want to get paid, right? And they don't want to go out of their way, and they definitely don't want to risk injury to their own lives for the sake of something that isn't even theirs, right? And so Jesus is pointing out the hired hands look to basically save their own skin. Whatever is going to be for their benefit. Like, again, if it's taking care of the sheep and getting paid, that sounds good. But as soon as my life is at stake, forget the sheep, I'm going to focus on myself. And what Jesus was doing in that is really offering a challenge to the religious leaders, I believe, who were doing exactly that with God's people. As long as they benefited, they had no problem leading. But as soon as things were out of their control or things were going the way that they didn't want to, they would do something for their own benefit instead of for the benefit of God's people. That's what hired hands are a great reflection of. And then Jesus is showing us that he's not like them, right? And I love the comparison of this passage in John 10 with Psalm 23 because I think they're beautiful reflections of one another. And in Psalm 23, we're reminded of the fact that the Lord is our shepherd, and he leads us in good places to restore us and to refresh us. And he protects us along the way with his rod and his staff. And he guides us in paths of righteousness for his namesake. All these images remind us of what Jesus, our good shepherd, does. And as a result, the things that happen when we follow the good shepherd, when we enter in through the gate, which is Jesus, and as we follow the Good Shepherd, he's given two different images of what of his role in our lives, I guess we could say. And there is confidence for us to experience when we do enter in through him. But for us to recognize what Jesus is drawing out of is wandering off in any direction that we please and not listening to his voice and doing things that we think we want to do in the moment, whatever benefits us the most, leaves us vulnerable to the attacks of those that have ill intentions. But the Good Shepherd shows us that he is willing to lay down his very life to make sure that he leads his sheep into the place that we need to go. There's a beautiful contrast taking place. A reason Jesus gives for us being willing to listen to his voice for where he desires to lead us to. Let's continue on in our passage. Verse 14, it says, I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. And I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice. And there shall be one flock and one shepherd. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. The Jews who heard these words were again divided. Many of them said, he is demon-possessed and raving, mad. Why listen to him? And I think I left off the tail end of that passage where other people were responding. Does this sound like the man, or has anyone got their Bible and can read that passage for me? I know I left off. Something to do with, can a man like this heal the eyes of the blind or something along those lines? Is that about right? Sound about right? Okay, so I summed it up basically what it says. You can look for the tail end in your passage. But essentially, again, that's that connection point in verse 21. Could a man who is outside of his mind, demon-possessed, heal the blind like Jesus did? And so what we see in this passage is this truth. Sheep of the Good Shepherd recognize his desire for relationship. And so Jesus is doing something where he's building a truth upon a truth, or a truth that leads to another truth, and a truth that leads to an even greater truth. Right? So his sheep hear his voice, and as a result, they follow him and they experience some of the things he wants to give them. And over time, what develops is this relationship between the shepherd and his sheep. And this is a key to much of our experience as followers of Jesus. Understanding God's desire for relationship with us. The other 2 points, again, are impacted by our willingness to engage with it. Jesus desires to know you, and he desires to be known by you. This abundant life that he's talking about, I come that they might have life and life to the full, is incredibly dependent upon this truth. And it cannot be experienced apart from relationship. Life to the full is dependent upon our relationship with Jesus, that connection that we get to share with him. For from that relationship flows life, and it produces good fruit in us, and it produces good fruit through us. And so we have to understand how important it is to responding to this. Jesus doesn't want to just be a casual, semi-consistent part of our life. He wants relationship with his people. He wants to walk alongside. That image of the song, so awesome that we sang that this morning. So cool. That image that he desires to walk with us and talk with us, to remind us that we are his own, and the joy that we get to share as we tarry there. Like, people don't realize how good that is. There's many who walk around us who just don't understand how awesome it is that we get to have a relationship with the God of the world. A relationship with the Good Shepherd who knows how to lead us on paths of righteousness that lead to life, who knows how to protect us when the enemy seeks to kill, steal, and destroy. What a joy that is for us. He's trying to help them see this truth, so he reminds them, I want to know my sheep, and I want my sheep to know me the same way, just as the Father knows me and I know the Father. Not in a small degree so that they can limp through life. I want them to know me like I know my Father, because when I'm placed in a difficult position, but I know my Father is with me, I'm okay. When he was in the Garden of Gethsemane on the night before he was arrested, that was an incredibly difficult time. But as long as he knew he was in the Father's will, he was okay. As long as the Father spoke to his heart in that moment, he would be able to take that next step of surrender. When we recognize that desire for a relationship, it changes things. And when we recognize that it's not just, okay, we've got to, convince God to have a relationship with us. We got to convince him to love us. Like, it is his great desire to love you to a depth that you've never experienced before. It is his great desire to speak to the places where you hurt. It is his great desire to let you know he is near. And he has this desire. It's not just for us. Like, he doesn't just want certain people who look a certain way and act a certain way to join the club, right? His desire is that there would be others who aren't a part of the flock who would be brought in, and that we would all listen to his voice. And we would be one flock, and he would be our shepherd, and we would be living according to his teachings. That's an encouraging thought, because what that reminds me of is God brings people who have different exteriors to a place where they can all be part of one flock because they have the same interior. They have that same desire to follow him and listen. And that can be a very encouraging thing for some people who struggle with whether God could ever love somebody like them, because they don't look like the people that they think God loves. They've got a past that maybe is more broken than they want. They've come from the wrong side of the tracks, and what Jesus is saying is, I am come for all who would draw near. I desire for them to be a part of the flock too, and for them not to just be a part of the flock and then, exist kind of on the fringes, where, the rest of us who are got our acts together more, whatever that means, can exist here, and they're just kind of, they want one flock interacting together, serving the purpose that God desires them to serve. We recognize Jesus' desire for relationship. And then Jesus reminds us again of just how far his love is willing to go. I'm the good shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep. And he's just not saying, I'm the good shepherd who's willing to do that. I'm the good shepherd that's going to do it. And I'm going to show you how far love is willing to go and what the impact of that love has, the power that comes. Jesus showed that to us when he went to the cross, and he showed it to us when he rose victoriously from the grave. What a beautiful image that echoes the truth of just exactly what kind of impact he wants this relationship with him to have in our lives. And again, when we understand how far love goes, isn't there something in us that says, maybe I'll listen to this guy a little bit more throughout my day? I mean, I'm pretty good at figuring out a way to wander off the path, and I'm pretty good at finding a way to get myself in trouble. Maybe I'll start listening to his voice a little more. Not just on Sunday, or not just in the morning because I'm a morning person, or in the evening because I'm an evening person, but every portion of my day, whether I am at my best or not, I want to tune my ear to listen to his voice and follow him. It's a desired outcome. And again, this is a great contrast to Jesus' audience, because they don't want to listen to his voice. Those in the crowd that are struggling to believe in him, they want to continue listening to whatever voices they think that they can trust, whether it's their own or those around them. They won't want relationship with Jesus. And because they refuse to enter in through that gate, and because they refuse to listen to what the Good Shepherd is saying, what do? They leave themselves open for attack. They put themselves in even greater danger. And so we look at this passage, and it's fantastic. just a really, really simple and yet powerful truth of what our relationship with Jesus is meant to look like. What truths can we apply from this to our own lives? Well, one of them is this: realizing that following the Good Shepherd is dependent upon listening to his voice. So we ask this question: how familiar are you right now with that voice? How frequently do you spend listening to him throughout your day? Again, this is that constant relationship that God desires us to have with him. He doesn't just speak on Sunday mornings for an hour. He's got a desire daily to speak through his word to you in the ways that guides you in paths of righteousness, in ways that help you respond to the things that you're facing. How much are we tuning our ears in to listen to him? In the midst of situations where we don't necessarily know what to do, or maybe in situations where we know what we want to do, but it might not fall in line with what he wants us to do. Are our ears tuned in to what he's seeking to say? You know, that's why it's so important for us to be in the Word on a consistent basis. And you can say, well, I'm not much of a reader, but there's even options for us who aren't necessarily tuned into opening up a book. There's audio. There's ways that we can hear God's Word on a daily basis. But the reality is, if we're not hearing that Word, how can we listen to his voice? How can we follow in the direction that he wants us to go in? That's why we spend time in the Word. That's why it's helpful to memorize the Word and hide it into our hearts. There's a psalm that says, I have hidden your Word in my heart that I might not sin against you. That I'll be able to respond when those moments come along. And so, in understanding that, we ask ourselves, how willing are we to remain near to the Good Shepherd throughout the day? Inevitably, there comes a point where either we want to listen to what we want for ourselves, or maybe on the flip side, we think that because we've been following Jesus for so long, that we aren't as needy, right? Like, those people who are new in their faith or are really struggling through a sin, well, they really need to be dependent upon God's Word, and they need to hide it in their heart. But, I'm pretty good right now. I followed Jesus for a long time, and I'm not really struggling with anything except ignorance at this point. I don't realize. We can have this tendency to think that we don't need to listen as much. It reminds me of the story of this woman. She was in the process of actually losing her hearing. And so she went to the specialist, and he had suggested that she have this operation to help improve it. And she promptly vetoed the idea and told him, listen, I am 94 years old, and I have heard enough. How many times, though, in our faith can we be like that? I'm not necessarily dependent on a daily basis. I've heard what I needed to hear, right? And that can put us in a very dangerous position when we begin to tune our ears or turn our ears off and stop listening to what God is seeking to say. He is the good shepherd that leads his sheep. And there's never a point for those sheep where they can say, you know what? I've got it. I know what to do now. I know where to go. I've walked these paths for years. You don't have to keep leading me, good shepherd. That kind of, if I get in trouble, I'll give you a call, send you a text message, something like that. They're never like that. They are always daily completely dependent upon the shepherd. And Jesus I think is very intentional in giving them that image. He could have chosen a lot of different comparisons, but this image of a sheep and its shepherd makes the point really clear of how important it is to continually listen to the shepherd's voice, where he wants to lead. Remember, his desire is for a relationship. And the more we're familiar with his voice, and the more we trust him and who he is and where he's leading, the more we respond naturally. It almost feels abnormal to not listen to the voice of the shepherd, right? And that's God's desire for us. And so do we believe this truth? Do we believe that it is ultimately vital for us to listen to the voice of the shepherd on a daily basis, more than we're listening to the other voices around us? Or do we seek to only listen to Jesus when we want to? Or even this, are there moments where Jesus' voice sounds remarkably a lot like ours consistently. Have you thought about that? Sometimes we think we're listening to God's voice, but it's amazing how much his voice sounds like me. Right? We have to realize that there are going to be moments when the Good Shepherd will tell us exactly what we don't want to hear, where he's going to lead us exactly where we don't want to go. And if he's always sounding like we would, I think we have to stop and ask ourselves, okay, am I just fooling myself into thinking I'm listening to what I think the Good Shepherd should sound like, instead of listening to what he does and what he is saying? Because he's not always going to say what I want. And he calls me to listen to him in those moments, trusting that he knows how to lead me into life. So we wrestle with that truth, but then I think we go on from that and not thinking beyond ourselves. We wrestle with this in light of this passage too. And not really wrestle, I guess I should say it this way. We realize how exciting this truth can be, that we can help others rejoice in the opportunity to follow the Good Shepherd. Jesus said he came to bring life, and life to the full, to all who would enter through him, to all who would follow him. A life that isn't for those who just deserve it or for those who only look and act the way that we do. And we get to communicate with people the opportunity to follow this Good Shepherd. The opportunity to help them see how good he is and how desirable following him actually is. One, we got to believe that for ourselves. If we don't fully believe that following the Good Shepherd on a daily basis is the most desirable thing for us to do within the course of that day, well, we got to start there, which is what we just did. But once we realize that the opportunity to follow his voice throughout our day is a joy for God's people. And even in the moments where that following that voice might be a touch difficult, it might not be a euphoric type of joy, but there is a peace in knowing that you trust where the Good Shepherd is leading you. And that there is joy that comes in the morning. It might be difficult in the night, it might be difficult for the moment, but there is joy coming down the road that's going to be worth it. And we get the opportunity to help others realize that. Think about that. So this message we share is one of hope. A message that, if received, can help someone begin to listen to where Jesus is wanting them to go. Walking down paths that lead to life, and walking away from paths where Satan and sin can continue to steal, kill, and destroy. That's the opportunity that we have to share with people. That they have this chance, this invitation to follow a shepherd who knows how to lead his sheep and who is willing to go to the uttermost. This reckless love that is willing to go even there to bring them back to where they belong. How powerful is that image? It's not always easy following the Good Shepherd, but it's always worth it. We get this joy of sharing it with other people. But we have to be wary of the fact that we can use our voices in ways that actually work contrary to people listening to the voice of the Good Shepherd. I'm reminded of the account in Numbers 13 and 14, where Moses sends the spies into the promised land to see and bring back a report of what the land is like. 10 of those spies used their voices to convince the people of God that he wasn't worth following. 10 of those spies said, it's too much for us. We might as well go back to where we know it's comfortable, where we're familiar with. 10 of those spies convinced people that God wasn't good. Think about that. But there was 2, Joshua and Caleb, who said, are you kidding me? Think about it, what he just did. He split open the Red Sea. He did all, I'm kind of putting words into their mouth right now. It doesn't say they said those exact words in the scripture. But think of all that he did. He saved us. He delivered us with a mighty hand. Of course he's going to be able to take us into this promised land. Of course he's good. Of course he's able. Let's follow him. Come on, guys. It's going to be awesome. This is the opportunity of a lifetime. They didn't listen to those two voices, though. They listened to the voices of those who would rather point at their circumstances instead of pointing to the God who is able. We have the opportunity to use our voices to do what Joshua and Caleb were trying to do, to help people listen to the Good Shepherd, helping them realize that it will be worth it, that God is worth following, that we can trust him. Do you believe that to be true? Do you believe you have an opportunity to speak life? There are so many reasons for people to become distracted by their circumstances or become more familiar with listening to voices who aren't necessarily speaking truths that are for their benefit. It's so easy for us to sometimes say things that don't help people respond to what the Good Shepherd says. But we have an opportunity to make a choice to partner with what the Good Shepherd is seeking to do in our families, in our church, in our community, in this world. We have the opportunity to use our voice to say, let's follow the Good Shepherd. We don't have to know all the details of how he's going to work all this stuff out, but he's good. And we've seen how far his love is willing to go for our sake. And we've seen what he's been able to accomplish. And we have been reminded of what he's able to do. Let's use our voices to speak those truths as we partner with God. And so as we look at this passage, this is a great, again, an amazing picture that really communicates such a simple but life-changing truth. Jesus is trying to help his audience in this passage and us today realize reasons that we can have for struggling to respond to him. Are we familiar with the voice of the shepherd, and do we trust that voice? And if we're not, what are we listening to in the moment? What's keeping us from responding in a way that will lead to life? And so he gives us a really beautiful image for us to hold on to. And the more time we spend near him, and the more time we continually respond to him, just the easier our reactions to him become. When a difficult circumstance comes our way and we're uncertain about, whether God is going to provide for tomorrow, because he's provided for so long, our natural default can be, my God is able. He'll see me through this circumstance. It doesn't have to be one that we give into anxiety and fear or frustration and anger or whatever, all those emotions that seem to enter in and have such control in our lives. Because when we hear his voice speak, there's just something about that voice. Something powerful, something worth following. But we have to understand, in order to follow the Good Shepherd well, he's not a buffet. We can't just pick and choose what we want to listen to, right? Like, I just want to listen to the desserts because that sounds fun. Or, I'm kind of a meat guy and don't really care about my vegetables. We have to listen to it all. We can't pick and choose. If we're going to follow him, we have to trust that whatever he's putting on the plate is for us to receive and to put into practice. Jesus is speaking and desires to lead us this morning. And when we go astray, here's how good he is. He doesn't shame us. He doesn't punish us in a way that's unbeneficial. He disciplines us for our benefit that we might share in his righteousness, absolutely. But he will go to the uttermost when we don't deserve it. The enemy will come along and point at us saying, no, you don't deserve to go back to the Good Shepherd. You abandoned him. He can't trust you. You're just not worth it anymore. I don't even know why he's coming after you. Just jump off the cliff or whatever dangerous situation you happen to be in. That's what the enemy will say, but the Good Shepherd will say, I'm the Good Shepherd of the sheep, and I lay down my life willingly. No one forces me to do it. I care. I love. I want to bring them in. That's what Jesus is reminding us of this morning. So I'll finish up with this quote. It's by a man named Philip Keller. And he once said, it takes some of us a lifetime to learn that Christ, our Good Shepherd, knows exactly what he's doing with us. And if that's true, if Jesus knows how to live my life better than I do, if he knows exactly what he's doing in and around me, why do I wrestle sometimes so much with how to respond in a situation? Why do I get so frustrated? Why can't I just be at peace and say, Jesus, I know you know what you're doing. I might not know what you're doing, but I know you know what you're doing. And so just continue to do what you're supposed to do. Lead me. Guide me in paths that I'm meant to walk on. I know the outcome is worth following. If we recognize that truth to be true, if we understand what Jesus is saying in this passage, then responding to him is quite easy. It might be challenging, but it's not complicated. And so how is God leading you to respond this morning to this message? As you're thinking through these truths, what is the Good Shepherd saying? And how do you need to respond? Take a moment and reflect on these truths, these questions that we have. We're going to have a couple minutes, and just take time to listen to what the Good Shepherd is saying, and really figure out, okay, what's the next step that I need to take in putting these things into practice?